Today's task is to service this Retina IIa camera. This has just been sent here by its owner for the normal full service. The camera itself works fairly well. Film advance feels normal, shutter works okay. Even the focus is a little bit stiff, but it's certainly quite usable. When I've checked out the window, the rangefinder appears to function quite well. It's a little bit cloudy, nothing uncommon there. So this should be a nice simple strip and service job. While I'm at it, I'm going to deal with the Zeiss bumps. There's a couple visible on the base there, and a couple of very prominent ones on the back here and here. A much less prominent one here. The leather looks to be very good on this. I will strip that leather completely from that back panel. The leather on the base, obviously I have to peel back this far anyway from this end in order to get to the screw to remove the struts for the bellows, but I'll just peel it further back so I can get to these two down here. So I'm looking forward to a nice straightforward job with this one. Should be an interesting project to watch. I'll do my best to explain things as I go along. Well, I'll start dismantling the camera by removing the top cover, and it usually start by removing the rewind knob. And I'll just put a screwdriver through the fork of the shaft to stop it turning. Unscrew the knob with your fingers, and it does the job. Put the knob to one side. This piece can go through the cleaner. Now for the top here, I've got a tool made to remove that, if I can just find it. That's my very messy toolbox. Here we have it. It's a pin spanner made just to suit these screws. Made that many years ago. Right, so I'm going to turn the lever around at 90 degrees. Just for easy access, gives me something to hang on to. Then unscrew that pinhead screw. That can join the tin of fasteners with its star washer. There's a star washer typically found under the head of that screw. Occasionally it's missing. It's not the end of the world if that's the case. Here's their counter disc. That doesn't go through the ultrasonic cleaner. Ultrasonic cleaners are very good at removing paint. The same with the top of the counter. That's got an engraved arrow filled with black paint. If I put that through the ultrasonic cleaner, the paint would be gone. These two components, they can certainly go through the cleaner. We've got a washer here. That can be cleaned. Here's our frame counter spring, or pawl. This one's intact, at least at the moment. This bent tip here is the piece that breaks off. And what happens is it just cracks across the top of the bend there, and then the end falls off, and so after that no more count. It doesn't cripple a camera, it's just a minor annoyance, and we all like everything to work. So I've removed the advance lever here. I very rarely need to strip these down. There's a little spring-loaded hook here which locks at the end of film. There's a rubber pad here which acts against the back of the top cover so it doesn't come back with a bang. Normally I'd replace that rubber if it shows any signs of failure. That one is not crumbling, it's nice and springy. I'll probably leave it in place. That all looks good. That's again is another part that won't go through the ultrasonic cleaner. Now, points to note. I'm looking at the top cover. Let's close this so we can see it better. Now the accessory shoe here is slightly distorted. You might pick it up from the play of light over at this point. And if from this angle, you may see it's actually bent up slightly at the sides. Something's happened to that. I would say that the camera was dropped with a flash on, fitted to the shoe, and that's pulled that back. The screw here is sticking right up through the accessory shoe. Now that would stop you being able to slide a flash all the way forward. That is certainly the sign of a repair that someone's done in a fairly half-assed fashion. Now the Retina IIa and IIa cameras, the shoes are held to the top plate in one of two ways. The traditional way is with screws fitted from the outside, so you see your screw heads on the top. And in cameras where that's been done, the serial number for the camera is found here. Now, probably for reasons of production, some bright spark came up with the idea is that they could serial number the shoes instead. But to stop people from being able to simply remove the shoe and swap it and therefore make the camera unrecognisable, they decided that they would fix the shoe to the top cover with screws from the inside, which was a very clever idea, except the screws are very small, they don't really have an awful lot of holding power, and if they come slightly loose, there's no way for the owner to tighten them back up again. So what tends to happen is that these screws do work loose and then they fall inside the top cover and you end up with a rattle. That's not the end of the world, having a rattle. The other exciting thing that they'll do is they'll find their way out through a gap in the top cover, like at this point or sometimes here, and so they'll get lost. But what you sometimes find is that one of those screws will have found its way down into the gears in the film advance and jammed things up, and that cripples the cameras entirely. In fact, what can happen is if that does happen and so the film advance doesn't want to move, some bright spark with their super thumb decides that it just needs a little extra push to clear the blockage. I don't know what people are thinking. And so they do, and they end up breaking something. And so then the camera is seriously compromised. Right, so top cover, 2 screws, one at each end, chrome plated screws, and easily scarred, so you need to take reasonable care with these. I'll pop that in that container with my screws. I'll lift off this top cover and I can have a look at the inside of this. Right, I'm having a look now at that screw that's poking up through the accessory shoe, and the head doesn't match the others, it's just completely different. So I'll find an original screw for that, and I'll have to do some panel beating on that shoe before that all goes back together. Back to the camera itself. We'll lift off the loose parts. So here's our film release button and its spring. The shutter release button, and the shutter release button on a Retina IIa should have a collar on it. This little collar which slides over the top there. That's fairly easily lost if you're a bit messy on doing your repairs. It's a bit hard to tell where it might come from. It has a very important function. Basically, it stops that shutter release button from being able to lift up any further than it needs to. And what tends to happen is, if it's not present, is that the camera may function normally most of the time, but occasionally, if you've tipped the camera upside down, the shutter button will lift off, and it will allow this post to lift out of its hole, its guide hole, and then the shutter can't be released because the post is no longer in the hole. So you end up with a camera that's jammed. You wonder what the hell's happened with it. But that'll be it. It'll be that the collar was missing off that shutter release. I'll pop that just back into place. Now I'm just checking one other thing here, which you probably can't see from this. And I'll just check if it's there or not. Yeah. Here's our shutter release shaft. We have a return spring. We have a collar. That collar fits over the larger shaft. That prevents you being able to depress the shutter release too far. Also, I'm trying to get it back out. Also, on the end of that shaft, that runs over a post down in the mechanism, there was a spacer, a tiny washer, fairly large diameter hole in the middle of the size of the washer. Now that's a spacer its job is it helps set the distance between the shutter release shaft on the camera and the release on the shutter itself. Frequently you lift this out of the camera, that little washer comes up with it and then immediately falls off and hides itself in the bellows or somewhere else, and when you put the camera back together again, if you don't discover that washer and get it back in place, you'll have a situation where you can press the shutter release, it releases the film advance ready for the next shot, but it doesn't actually fire the shutter. And since that washer, I saw it was present and it's now disappeared, I know that it's hiding somewhere down here, stuck in the grease or in a fold of the bellows or something of that nature, and I'll have to make sure I get that back. However, that's for later. Let's carry on with dismantling the camera. So I'm going to take off the rangefinder now. 2 screws. The rangefinder gets stripped and cleaned separately. I'll take off the film rewind post. Now the screws here are loose. That's not uncommon. Screws just can loosen up over time. And the two main causes for that, or the two things that get the blame for that, vibration and thermal cycling. Vibration is pretty obvious. If you rattle something about enough, things will start to move. And thermal cycling is where there's been temperature changes up and down repeatedly over time, and different metals expand and contract at different rates, and you end up with a situation where something that was tight is no longer tight. So I'll just dismantle these sections and they'll go through the cleaner. So we can take off this film advance stuff now. That collar, you be careful not to lose that collar. It goes on top of the gear here. Sometimes there may be a thin washer there as well, a shim or spacer. That's, if it's present, it certainly needs to go back. If it's not there, you'll end up with a situation where the film advance lever may stick out. It may not want to return to the park position, and that's because the height between this component and the release lever are incorrect, and they are set by having that shim washer in place where it's needed. Okay, so I've just removed that. I'll cock that shutter by pressing that cocking rack all the way through. And that's to allow me access to a screw. There's 3 screws on this plate, 1, 2, and there's one down just here. Now I just want access to this one, so I've just released that catch there, pulled it back out of the way. This allows this to unwind and I can get access to that screw. So we have 2 plain screws there. At the front, in this position here, we have a return spring on that, and I'm just lifting it up and across from where it's trapped behind that lever, and then I can undo the screw. With springs, it's always important to release the tension from them before you undo the screw that's holding them down in place. Otherwise, well, you know what happens, they tend to disappear across the room into the deepest recesses and you'll never see the things again. Alright. So this gear just transmits the action to the cocking rack from the film advance. I'm just checking that that's good. I'm not expecting any trouble with that. This camera was functioning fairly well. The cocking rack on the Retina IIas are very robust. I can't remember when I last saw a problem with one of those. Occasionally you'll see reference saying that the cocking racks on the Retina IIas are a source of trouble and a weakness, and people should have a Retina 2 instead, and it's all a load of crap. The Retina IIas, the cocking racks are very robust. So we'll remove the film advance components now. Well, I just came to the end of that track apparently. That will be almost certainly file size limitation. I'll deal with that later. I was just saying that this component is very important. That drives the film advance mechanism, drives that dog around and things. Or that dog drives this piece actually. There's a ratchet on here. The ratchet wheel is a ratchet you can see on the top surface here, and there's a ratchet on the bottom surface here going in the opposite direction. That allows you to, when you advance the film, it means that you can move the film advance lever clockwise, but it won't return until you get to the end of the stroke, whereupon this release pops up to the other ratchet and allows you to return the lever to the rest position, but you can't swing it forward again until it's hit its stop and until you've released the shutter. So that'll go into the cleaner. Now there's a fine coil spring under that. Yes, this drive dog here. It's got a recess on one side. That's where the spring acts against it. It's just completely flat and plain on the base. That'll go in the cleaner. We can lift off this release shaft and assembly. That can go in the cleaner. And we can remove this wheel, which is the ratchet wheel. It stops this from rolling backwards because there's a wee ratchet pawl there. That can go in the cleaner. We can remove this screw holding that little ratchet pawl in place, and its spring and its spacer. So There's a spacer that goes between the pawl and the base of the camera. That goes onto the top of the camera, the pawl goes on top, then the shaft goes through the three of them. Now, we haven't retrieved the spring from the release lever yet. That lives down that hole there. And we'll just tip the camera upside down, give it a shake. There it is. That's the spring. Now, it's very much like the spring that came from the film release button, except the spring from the film release button is usually longer and it's slightly smaller in diameter, only very slightly, but it will fit down the hole here in the tube, the film release lever, and the other one will not, so it's not too hard to sort them out. Now there's that washer, that spacer from the shutter release that I told you had got away. It's just appeared miraculously. It was obviously tucked up with one of those components I've just removed. So I've got to be careful not to lose that, otherwise it's an awful job trying to get the film release and the shutter release to activate at the same time. So carrying on, we've got 3 screws holding the top of this guide on. And this guide carries idler gears that effectively couple the film sprocket and the film take-up spool together. And these are gears that sometimes get damaged if some foreign body gets in and jams in the space between one of these idlers and that gear there, for example. That's a prime spot for failure. And that would be if some foreign body gets in, and the sort of foreign body I'm thinking of are one of those 3 tiny screws that held the accessory shoe on from the inside. Okay, so we'll just be able to shake out the clutch assembly. The clutch assembly's job is to provide controlled friction so that the take-up spool has some slippage available to it, because as the film is wound through the camera, it builds up on the take-up spool, and if you had a fixed relationship of rotation of the take-up spool and the film sprocket, the take-up spool would be building up in diameter, and so therefore pulling a greater and greater length of film past the gate than the sprocket would. And so you would end up tearing out the sprocket holes, and in fact that's what would happen if this component was jammed up or rusted or really stuck with some inappropriate grease. It wouldn't be something you'd see very often. That'll be clean, very lubricated, no problem. So basically that's it for the top of the camera. Next we can turn our attention to the bottom of the camera. Okay, to the bottom of the camera. Right, so I've got 2 screws here. These screws hold the surround to the tripod socket. And one of them's being a little bit reluctant, so I'm going to have to be a bit careful with that. They're brass, they're fine, and they're easily damaged. They're chrome plated too, so that if you scar them up, it'll be obvious that you scarred them up. Let's see if this will come off. I'm looking at this tripod socket and it looks like, no, it's going to come off. What happens with tripod sockets is often they're distorted, and they're distorted because someone has forced a tripod screw in there too far, or one that's badly formed so that it's broader at its base instead of being nicely parallel. And if this gets spread, you can't pull this collar off the outside of it because it's such a firm fit. That can go aside. Alright, So now we have the leather. So the leather, let's get to that. Now all the Retina IIa cameras had leather coverings. I think some Retina IIa cameras had leatherette coverings. Not all of them, just some of them. And leatherette on those models is very fragile, extremely hard to get off in one piece, and you want to avoid removing it pretty much at all costs, because you probably end up having to replace it. This leather's a bit rubbery feeling. It's just using a small screwdriver here to slide down that edge. Yeah, that leather's quite flexible, it's quite rubbery, it's a bit unusual. Often the leather is stiffer than that. Because it's fairly rubbery, it probably means it would stretch easily. Now, you don't want to stretch leather because it's very hard to unstretch leather. Sometimes it bounces back, but more often than not it doesn't. So I'm sliding my scalpel down underneath this. The glue layer is not peeling off. You can see leather fibres still stuck to this base. So basically I'm peeling the leather away from its skin, you could say, almost. That's better. That's sliding away nicely. Got to be very careful not to slip and to keep your blade well down in contact with that body surface so that you don't accidentally slip and poke it through the leather. You can always disguise minor errors of judgment like that if they do occur. It's much easier with leatherette than leather, strangely enough. Bit better if you don't have to. Right, so I'm just about down to that. It's like it's delaminated, this leather. It's like its skin is not moving with the base. In an ideal world, you'd strip the leather completely from the base. When they built these retinas, the leather went on first and then this boss went on afterwards. It's riveted on over the top of the leather. If you wanted to remove the leather from here, you would have to cut it all the way around that perimeter carefully with a scalpel, and I don't want to do that. I just want to peel it back far enough to make sure that when I glue it, I can get it to lie smooth and flat, since it's not particularly smooth and flat looking at the moment. I'm just peeling away any loose bits from the base here. That's mostly adhesive and just shavings that have come off the back of the leather. I don't want any of those to fold back on themselves when I'm gluing it, so that they end up with a bump under the leather, since one of the reasons we're peeling the leather is to get rid of the Zeiss bumps. We don't want to be creating artificial Zeiss bumps. Right, so what we've done here is we have exposed 2 screws here holding that little bracket in, or that shield. That shield goes around the rewind button to stop it accidentally being bumped. And 3 screws here holding the tripod socket. There is 1 screw right here. That's the hinge pin screw for the front door. And underneath here, you can find it, where's it hiding, is the screw holding the bellows struts in place. And I'm just scraping away this glue and remains of leather, and it's just surfacing now. That screw there. There's a matching screw in that position on the top plate. And then there are two more that we've also got to get out. So, to these screws. Now the screws, particularly this one and this one, those screws are brass. They're commonly got verdigris on them, the green scunge. The slots in these screws are variable in their depth. They're usually not very deep. You need a good screwdriver, need plenty of pressure on it. Otherwise you'll just cam out, make a mess. They're fine. I'll pop those in the cleaner, those two, get that muck off them. Excuse me. That aluminium shield can come off, that can go through the cleaner. 3 screws hold the tripod socket. Tripod sockets on Retina cameras are often loose. The 3 screws, they're all held by 3 screws. Typically the screws come loose, and they come loose for multiple reasons. One reason would be the normal one, that temperature cycling and vibration. The other reasons would be just the fact that people have been screwing tripods into them. Sometimes people aren't careful enough, they screw the screw in too far. Most tripods tended to have another screw, a nut on the end of that tripod screw, so you could adjust how much thread actually poked out. Sometimes people didn't take any notice of that. They'd try and screw a 10 mils of tripod screw into 8 mils of socket, and inevitably that would cause damage. And that sort of behaviour, that's what loosens up tripod sockets. Right. Just close that front. And we'll get this rewind button off. That's our next task.